Thank you for joining us for sort of this part 2 session with talking about digital accessibility. And today we wanted to really give you all the opportunity to ask questions, share stories, ask for additional resources, and really talk about strategic planning and next steps. Because Devin and I threw a lot of information at you in part 1. And so today in part 2, we have more resources to share, but we really wanted to focus on any questions or specific needs that you might have with regard to the work that is happening in your LEAs. So I'm joined again today by my colleague Devin Wellington. So what we wanted to do was talk about making accessibility a reality in your LEAs. And there's 2 ways you can participate today if you prefer to talk on the phone. Right now everybody's lines are muted, but you can go ahead and press the button that you can see in your sidebar to raise your hand, and Marcelino will unmute your line if you have a specific comment or question. Or you can feel free to use the chat box to put in if there's anything that came up during our last session or anything in particular that you have specific questions about or would like more resources on. Feel free to throw that in the chat box. So one of the first things we thought might be a good way to start talking about this is getting the key players together to work together to address accessibility, because one thing that we tried to drive home last month in our session is that this is really a team effort. Everybody is responsible for this. It's not just a special education problem. It's something that technology people, content people, curriculum administrators, web developers, everybody needs to be working together. And so I wanted to talk about planting that accessibility seed in your LEA. Did anyone have a chance or get any kind of sense for what's happening in your state, in your LEA? Do you have any sense for, whether there are accessibility policies currently, or whether that's something that LEAs need help with? Particularly with staff needs around professional development. Are there any primary needs and concerns that have sort of bubbled up for you all as you've had some time in between session 1 and now session 2? I'll give people a second in case anyone wants to raise their hand or pop something in the chat. Doesn't look like anyone has any questions yet. That's okay, I'll keep moving. But feel free to jump in at any time if there are specific things that you feel like your schools and districts need help with, or things that we can point you towards that might be useful, or specific professional development materials that you think they would need. So going back to sort of this beginning of planting the seed with your LEAs, these are really the big questions that they need to ask, but also that states can help guide this work with thinking about whether the school or district has a visible accessibility policy on their website. An internal accessibility policy is important as well for staff and teachers to be able to sort of know where to look, know what's expected of them. But having an external accessibility policy, or even a simple accessibility statement on the website, is really critical, so that parents and teachers and students know where to go if they need help with getting more accessible materials. Being able to understand how people with disabilities are currently using the content that the school or the district is providing, whether it's websites, classroom blogs, it's software and learning materials, accessible educational materials, understanding how your students with disabilities are using this material and what types of assistive technology they're using, and being able to identify what your primary needs and concerns are. It's going to be different in every school or every district, with some similarities obviously across the board. And so if you were to go about sort of doing some of this work, you need to build a collaborative team to start this sort of strategic planning process. As we mentioned, it really does need to be everybody involved, because everybody has a little bit of a piece of this puzzle with thinking about how to ensure that technology is accessible, whether it's technology coordinators, educators, people who are responsible for curriculum and instruction, people who are responsible for thinking about accessibility of assessments, and then beyond that, web and digital content developers that you may be working with, external people as well as internal. Is this some, oh, it looks like there's a comment, a question. Oh, no, it's just Marcelino. So is this something that is happening in your states? Do you have collaborative teams? Is this something that is just beginning, or something that you might need additional support with, or what's happening at the sort of school and district level? And again, if you want to just raise your hand or put something in the chat if you have specific questions or specific needs. Devin and I came prepared with a lot of resources today, as we did last time. But we want to make sure that we're specifically showing you or pointing you to things that can be useful in your specific context and address specific needs that you have in your state. Otherwise, we're happy to just do show and tell. We have some cool things to show today.
Elise, this is Devin. Just to chime in, I was involved in training in the southern states a couple months ago, where we met with state leaders talking about building their teams, and a lot of them mentioned, you know, we want X, Y, and Z. Here's our dream team, but we just don't have the funding for it. Or, you know, a lot of these people who are their state technology coordinators said, like, this is all on me to do all of this, and I need more support. And so those were some of the challenges that they had expressed, and then, you know, trying to work down to the district level and the school level to develop those teams when they didn't feel like at the state level sometimes they even had the best format to model. Or so I don't know if anyone also has experienced that either at the state or district local level. We'd also be interested in hearing, you know, kind of what you do have, what you don't have, what you wish you had. We can talk through how to get there as well.
And that's a really good segue to our next slide, Devin.
Like I knew what was coming next.
I know. It's like you knew what I was going to say next. So yeah, Devin makes a really good point. A lot of what we've heard in talking to states, you know, when we've gone and done face-to-face events and workshops and conferences, is the challenge of bringing everybody together, finding the funding for everybody to work together. And one of the main issues with that is really obviously that there's silos still. There's silos everywhere, but there's still a number of silos between, you know, assistive and instructional technology, or between special ed and general ed. And the challenge there is sort of breaking down some of those barriers or building bridges across agencies, across departments, across, you know, different divisions, so that you can both encourage collaboration but also find ways to reduce redundancy and combine funding. A lot of the guidance that we've been getting from the Department of Education and from the Office of Special Education Programs and the Office of Educational Technology is that they really want people, they really want states and schools and districts to be thinking about how to marry funding together, how to blend and braid funding streams together, how to use funds, you know, under IDEA, and how to use funds under other programs that are designed for technology, and work together. So if you're developing really great accessible learning experiences for all students, that's not only benefiting students with disabilities, and conversely, if you're developing really great innovative technology supported learning environments for your school, sort of from a general education perspective, you can also ensure that you're focusing on universal design for learning and accessibility. And so by doing that, you can really combine funds together and create professional development opportunities for all your teachers, but that address these various aspects and ensure that technology is accessible for your students with disabilities. And that really does require a lot of leadership support, because it's hard work. It's hard to reach out across you may not know these people very well, or you may not know what's happening sometimes in other departments or other agencies, or even within a school, you may not always know what's happening in special education. And so to be able to model that from a leadership perspective to help break down those barriers and really encourage collaboration and encourage creative thinking about how can we use special education funds, how can we use some of the funds for assistive technology and ed tech, and all these different things that we're working towards, and what are our common goals, and what ways can we combine our funding to create a vision for technology that is accessible for all of our students. And so this isn't necessarily a question you have to answer now unless you feel like you have an answer to it, but we wanted you to think about how your work at the state level can help encourage that district collaboration to ensure accessibility, and help people start to think about how they can work together to all move towards this common goal, because it really is a common goal. We all want our students to succeed, and we want them to be able to use technology, whether it's assistive or instructional technology, in a way that is improving their learning opportunities. And to go a little bit further in that, and some of the things I was talking about, is having these silos really can hinder the accessibility planning process. You have competing priorities or a lack of a clear vision. You have potentially staff in one area that have a lot of expertise and staff in another area that have a lot of expertise, and they're not communicating, or they aren't aware of those levels of expertise, and so they might be competing efforts, and everybody's reinventing the wheel every time they try to solve a problem. Whereas if they had a little bit more of a collaborative environment, or were able to easily sort of find out what was happening, we could find ways to combine their efforts. Good ideas and best practices really have a hard time spreading when these types of silos exist, and you spend time and money on individual issues or putting out fires instead of working together to try to find a way to create a system-wide solution to accessible technology. And so has anyone started doing some of this work at your states? Are there things happening to try to address the silos between special ed, general ed, Title I, and think about how to work together? Is this something, I know Maine has been doing a lot of work in this area and has written a lot of planning documents. I don't know if there's anyone on the phone from Maine about addressing silos in special ed and general education. And New Jersey has also done some recent planning. So if anyone has any experience with this, or has started this work in their states and wants to share sort of experiences or challenges, what worked, what didn't work. I see a comment that says that Utah has been working on this a lot. That's good to hear. And how has that been going? Successes, challenges, things that others can learn from?
Rebecca, we can unmute you too if you want to talk.
Yeah, if it's easier to speak, Rebecca, that's rather than try to type fast.
Rebecca, I went ahead and unmuted you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that has worked really well is to try and kind of intersperse people in different departments. So for example, there's two of us that are involved in the multi-tiered system of supports project within special education. We have another person in teaching and learning, another person that's involved in student support services. So just really trying to spread the influence, and then also have a lot of cross-disciplinary teams. So when we're looking at teaming to solve a problem, specifically right now we're working on making sure that our website is accessible, all of the documents, media, things like that that we create are accessible, and then also transferring that training to LEAs. And that's something that I've been working on, people in other departments have been working on, and trying to come together and say, okay, as a state, what do we do to meet this problem, instead of as this little section or this little section. And so that's been really helpful, is coming up with ways to do those cross departmental or cross-section teams to be able to set up action plans to solve a common challenge or problem.
Excellent. And yeah, that's such a perfect illustration of, you know, because there are common problems, and you realize when you start talking to people across that, oh, you guys are also encountering this, or we can, you know, this is something that if we all work together to solve is a lot more efficient than all trying to solve it individually.
Agreed.
So thank you so much for sharing your real world experience.
Yeah.
So, and actually, we have some resources that we put together kind of on that, you know, developing a plan. And so we can, I have no real intention of going through these slides in order today. We threw mostly slides together so that we would have, if we wanted to show something, we could show a specific resource. But that might be a good segue, Devin, to show some of the resources that we have about developing plans and
Sure.
actually putting these materials together. And yes, NERN, which I always feel silly saying as an acronym, the National Implementation Research Network, Rebecca just commented, has some really great implementation science resources, and they do indeed. And one thing, we have actually some on our CTD website as well. I can send out some of those resources, but as part of a previous project that several of us on the CTD team worked on, we developed an implementation practice guide for administrators that really pulled on the work that the National Implementation Research Network does and put it in practical terms. You know, how do you build a team? How do you plan? How do you, you know, define your budget and everything and set goals and visions, and how do you work to support teachers and create professional development opportunities, and sort of taking it through the whole cycle of implementation. So we can share those links as well, and the NERN website is also a really great resource. So
yeah,
Rebecca nicely said all these things that are on my slide, so I don't need to say those things about building bridges. So I'm going to click through to sort of defining this. This leads nicely into, you know, thinking about defining the problem and actually developing a plan in your state, and, you know, starting to do this work that Rebecca was talking about, and developing shared definitions of the problems and challenges, being able to get on the same page with everybody and start this process of addressing accessibility, whether it's website accessibility or accessibility of content. It all sort of starts in the same place. And so Devin has some really nice resources to show quickly that can help through this process and make it a little bit less onerous, although it's still it still can be a large task, certainly. But there's a lot of really great tools out there. So Devin, do you want me to show something while you talk, or
why don't you
make you presenter?
Yep, that would be great.
Sure. And again, feel free to raise your hand or type something into the chat if there's specific things that would be useful to you. Devin and I can point you in the right direction.
Absolutely. Can you all see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. So before we get in, we have 6 steps to your accessibility audit that we wanted to go through, hoping that it would be helpful. But before we do that, Elise mentioned, you know, working across organizations, working across funding streams, and one of the ways that we can do that is through the new ESSA guidelines that came out. I know a lot of states are working on their state plans for implementing ESSA, and we actually did make this nice little infographic about technology funding that can come through Title IV Part A. And so I just wanted to call your attention to this about, you know, how to get more funding for technology in your state. That funding can be 15% of it can be up used for hardware and software and actual tools. But that means that, so up to 60% of the funding that comes under this Title IV Part 8 can be used for technology if you're getting more than $30,000 in Title IV funding. But that means that 45% of it can be used for, 45% can be used for professional development and capacity building, which is a huge amount. If you're looking at it percentage-wise, that would also really support teachers and LEAs. And so I think that this can be blended and braided, with IDEA funds and to support some of the work that we're also talking about here, right? With doing your accessibility audits and ensuring that you have the technology in place to do the assessments that you need to. So now to talk through some steps for the accessibility audit is the first step is to determine your accessibility goals and the standards with which you aim to comply. And that will make more sense kind of as we go through this and show some examples of different accessibility goals. So the next step is to run an accessibility audit using a selected tool. And so this is one that Elise found. Actually, it's a really cool tool. It's called Code Sniffer. And what you essentially do is you put your either HTML code, or you can actually add like an add-on button to your toolbar that you just click it and it checks whatever website you're looking at for accessibility. So, for example, it would say, there's one error based on WCAG AA standards, or your 5 wordings, and then it actually shows you a list of what those are. And this is a really great tool for how to go ahead and start your accessibility audit. We, of course, think that for a full audit, oftentimes you actually need a dedicated accessibility person. This is, again, breaking down the silos. And then you have to be in partnership with your developers and your web team. But this is a really good start and a quick way to say, hey guys, like this is something we have to work on because our homepage for our website has 25 errors, and that's it's a really great starting point. Next slide. And so then we also saw, as we were looking through to find some information, that this great idea to track errors in a spreadsheet. So it's just a simple way to organize, the different errors that you might come across. How, the success criteria. So what are you trying to accomplish, and then the recommendation, and then another column about who's handling it, or the time frame for which you plan to address it, or if it has been addressed. I just thought it was a really great way to think through some of the challenges and organize all of those many challenges that can come with doing an accessibility audit.
It's also,
and so then yeah.
Sorry, Devin. I was going to say it's also a good idea to add, there's not in this little example table, but a good idea to add sort of a priority level.
Mm-hmm.
And also to address the easy ones first, because something like color contrast might be really easy to fix, or adding alt text to images, addressing headers, and to start off right away with 10 or so things that you just cleared right off the list is a really great motivator, because you feel like you've accomplished something.
Absolutely. And that speaks to this next slide too, which, determine the best place to start. Sometimes the best place to start, like Elise said, is someplace you know that you can accomplish things pretty easily, like a color contrast checker, right? You can go through and check the color contrast on your page. Rebecca also just asked a really great question about the color contrast and the infographic that we just showed, right? So talking about whether or not this is compliant is a great question, and something that we do think about as we develop out these resources. And as some of that has been, even on our team, happening retroactively. Like we go back and think, oh, did we check that when we were developing it? excuse me. Sometimes, when we're getting into design things, you just want to make it look pretty. And so we've worked with our internal department to ensure that all of our downloadable resources are 508 compliant. So when you go to download the actual resource, it has alt tags and all of that. And a quick and easy way to do this too, if you have something like an infographic, is to just include text on a following page if it's, especially if it's heavily graphic and not a lot of text, or just to ensure that, a screen reader could read it. You can just, excuse me, add, a page of text that goes through exactly what you're talking about so that the content is not lost. Elise, do you want to speak to that anymore?
Sure. Yeah, so as Devin said, this is something that, even though we think about accessibility all the time, we still struggle with because it is hard. You're thinking about when you're designing something, oh, this looks nice, or these colors look pretty together, or this is visually appealing. And it is, it's developing a habit of mind when we go through and develop these things to then go and use, some of these tools to check them. We're also fortunate that at AIR we have people in our publications department that are accessibility experts, and so we'll run these things through them, which does speak to sometimes the importance of having an accessibility expert, whether it's at the state level or at a district level, or an outside consultant, somebody that can really help you build capacity and ensure that you know what you're doing. Devin has gone through some training with our internal people about how to create accessible PDFs, and so we're learning these things so that we can do more of this stuff on our own. But it's always nice to have somebody who really lives and breathes accessibility that we can flip these to ourselves, even though like I said, we think about it and talk about it a lot, to say, can you just double check this and make sure we didn't miss anything? Or, what's the best way? When we started making infographics, we had to go to them and say, what's the best way to make an infographic accessible? And so it really can be valuable to bring in somebody, even just on a consultant basis, that can help you with some of these questions and get you started in terms of, what do we need to think about when we're developing visuals like an infographic here or some kind of visual resource for a student. What's the best way to address color contrast? What's the best way to address alt text on something that's largely visual? And they can help you think through that process. And then, empower teachers or empower content creators to be able to make these changes and make these decisions on their own as they're creating content. But at first, it's definitely a little bit of a steep learning curve.
Yes, it is. And if you look at this infographic here, right, so this one, it says, did your district receive more than 30K in Title IV funding, is likely compliant, this little line right here, right, because the color contrast, just from a cursory glance, although we could go through and check it, is likely compliant. There's enough contrast. However, this yellow on gray probably isn't, and that's something that we'll want to ensure that when we provide a downloadable resource or a resource for a screen reader, that we're addressing those needs. Okay. So the next step is to test your accessibility audit. So once you've gone through, you've done the checklist, you've started with your different steps, you've determined the best place to start, you've decided, what we really want to focus on our headings on our website. And you go through and you think your headings are perfect. Then another good thing to do, in addition to running this check again, would be to test it out with a screen reader. So there's a couple different commonly known screen reading tools for various devices and operating systems that are mostly free, it seems, and can be used to test it out. And so, yeah, this process is iterative, and it's something that needs to continue to happen, and it's not obviously just a one-time deal. And then the final step that we're going to present today is to verify it with a human, right? So we have all these really great tools of how to go through and check with technology, but it's really important to get a real user in to see what works and what doesn't for them, what's intuitive for a user and what's not. You know, what makes sense as far as reading order is that document that you made, you know, you spent hours in Adobe making accessible as a PDF. Did that stick, and do they, does their screen reader make sense of it? So there's a lot of you know, tools and websites out there that can show you, you know, how to do that. This is a great one. It's actually through Ontario, the city, I believe, through the actual city of Ontario, that about how to create an accessibility plan and policy. And it gives you different steps to consider. And we have some example plans that we can provide you as well. And most of them are out of Canada or through higher education. They seem to be a little bit ahead of us in this. And so you can see that these plans are multi-year. They seem lengthy. Most of them are 30 to 60 or more pages because they're incredibly comprehensive and well thought out. So we can send you, and this will be in the PowerPoint that is shared with attendees afterward also, links to all of these just to provide some context. Also Oregon State, this is the Oregon State University, so higher ed accessibility plan too. And you'll notice that theirs addresses actual physical accessibilities, facility barriers. That's one of the priorities in this. But they address, like, we know that there are other barriers that are keeping students with disabilities from, you know, succeeding in the way that they can, and we will get to those. But for right now, our focus is going to be on the actual physical barriers. And I think that that's a good example of, you know, addressing, like, hey, this is coming, we're aware, and this is where we're going to start. And so this is just a nice little slide that shows all of the things that these accessibility plans had in common. They all started with an aim and objective. They all explain, you know, the board or the work group who is focusing on this, who's involved, right? How did they break down their silos? What departments are included? You know, commitment to ensuring accessibility, the standards with which they're complying, right? So if you don't say the standards with which you're complying, it's hard to be able to assess that, or for someone who's reading it to know what your standards are and what level of accessibility they can anticipate from you. A plan to communicate this accessibility plan, the various barriers that they're going to address for. So again, Oregon State said we're going to address from 2013 to 2018, I think, physical barriers. And then it talks about each of the plans that we found talked about ongoing initiatives, how they were going to review and monitor. So again, that iterative process of accessibility planning. So again, all of those plans are kind of, they seem beefy, and I can imagine a little intimidating, but I'd be curious to know if any of you have started this process of developing an accessibility plan, if you already have one, if it's multi-year, what that kind of looks like. I'd be interested to hear that as well. Okay.
Or if you do, you know, some states or schools or districts may have, similar to the University of Oregon there that you were showing, an accessibility plan thinking about physical accessibility. But they may not have extended that same kind of plan to think about digital accessibility. the process is similar. So if if there's things where we've talked about, how are we ensuring that our school is meeting accessibility needs, in the same way that somebody building a brand new school tomorrow would never think to, build a school, you would hope, would never think to build a school without a ramp, for example, or without elevators if needed for access for students with disabilities. We want that same level of thinking to start to shift into the digital realm, that nobody will think about building a website without thinking about accessibility, or that nobody will think about creating educational content and not thinking how are students with disabilities going to use this. It's a barrier to them.
Yeah, it looks like Rebecca said that they have started this in Utah. I don't know if, Rebecca, we can pick on you one more time to talk about how that's gone.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've created a list of the compliance standards, the AA minimum. We're actually striving for AAA. And then with that, we went through and made a checklist of items that people commonly create. So at the state office, we create a lot of, Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, things like that. And so we wanted to have a common understanding of what did it mean for those things to be accessible. And then from there, we created some example documents that have the document as it appears to a reader, and then the same document with blocked text that shows what the features are that actually make this document accessible and compliant, to kind of point it out, because sometimes the features aren't readily visible that were built in, and so helping people to understand, we use styles, make sure you have a title and headings and the basic organization. And then the other thing that we've done, besides doing section trainings, is sending out surveys to do some data collection and to see what people are comfortable with, what areas do they feel like they need more help, who needs specific coaching, what areas do they need coaching. So we're really looking at kind of on the implementation science side of things. Once we've put the information out there, how do we sustain this, how do we build this, how do we build capacity, and that's, obviously it's still a work in progress, but we've made, I think, good progress in the couple of months that we've been specifically working on this.
No, it sounds like it.
Yeah, have people been responsive to your surveys? Do they seem interested in creating this type of accessible content? Or has that been a challenge and a barrier, is to get people on board?
I think the challenge and barrier isn't necessarily getting people on board. The challenge and barrier is because the project seems to be huge. When you look at, all of the different presentations and professional development items, or we just recently revised our special education rules, and going through the process of making sure that large document met all the accessibility requirements. Those are the things where people look at it and they think, wow, this is a lot. You mean I have to revise every single thing, that I've done? And so really getting people to kind of step back from that feeling of being overwhelmed, and instead, looking at, okay, we're creating everything accessibly from this time forward, and then going back and saying, okay, of my collection of documents and things that maybe I posted on the website, which things do we actually use?
Right.
And, prioritizing from there. The buy-in part hasn't been as difficult, simply because, first of all, it's an OCR requirement.
Right.
So it's not a negotiable.
It's not optional, yeah.
Right.
And I think that kind of takes that, well, why question out of the way. And really the biggest barriers have to do with the how. How do we do this?
That's all really great advice, and it's really exciting to hear about. I mean, Devin and I can talk about these things, like, here's how you should address this. But it's really exciting to hear about how it's happening at the state. And even though it is a challenge, and I think it's a challenge for every organization, I'm, even at at AIR, like I said, or when we're working on things, or I'm working with a web developer, it's a habit of mine for myself, and my background is in special ed and assistive technology, to say, oh, right, and this all needs to be accessible. Make sure, to make sure I'm asking those questions all the time of technology developers that I'm working with, or content people that I'm working with. And it can seem huge when you have a lot of documents or a lot of existing content that you have to go back and think about. But I think you're right. Setting your line in the sand and saying, from this day forward, we're going to create things in this way using these templates because it will help make the documents more accessible. And then we'll prioritize some of these things that maybe nobody even uses that anymore. It's a document from 15 years ago. Does it even need to be on the site? Or things that are really active and a big part of our daily practice or our daily work that we can focus on and create those as more high priority. I'm going to switch presenter back, Devin, because I actually installed this the thing that Devin was showing on my. I put it on boston.com right now because I live in Massachusetts. This HTML code sniffer, and because I think this. Let's see if it'll work here. There it is. I'll move this over to the middle. Boston.com, come on. So I was playing with this for multiple hours the other day, going to every website I could think of, and so I wanted to show you how it actually works. You can choose whether you want Section 508, WCAG 2.0 Level A, AA, or AAA, and really get a sense for, sort of where things are in terms of errors and warnings. But the coolest part about this is when you actually view the reports, and it explains each element to you. Trying to find a good example. Okay, so you can see, I don't know if you can see this little bouncing ball. It'll point out if it's an actual element on the page. Sometimes it's hidden element, so it won't show you where it is, but it will actually show you sort of this little bouncing ball icon, and it will give you the exact snippet of code that is problematic. So this is good for your web developers to have if you pull these things into a chart. And it also talks about the section of the guidelines that it specifically addresses. So if I go to WCAG, because Rebecca, you said you guys were shooting for AA or even AAA. So let's see. I'll just pick one at random here. So for the WCAG, it'll actually tell me, as opposed to the 508 guidelines, it'll tell me the specific part of the guidelines. But with the WCAG, it'll tell me which principle, which we talked about in the last webinar with robust, understandable, perceivable. And it'll link me to specific techniques for how to address this problem. And so this is a really great tool both for the non-tech people, just conducting a simple audit and being able to create a chart to start to develop a plan so your team can do this. But this is also a really great resource for the people who are responsible for maintaining your website within, whether it's the state level or within a school or district, because it takes them directly to the success criteria, how to meet it, and what this means, and specifically what you should do and how you should change your code to make sure that you address it. And one of the cool things about this tool, I didn't see any on boston.com with color contrast, but it will actually say, the color contrast may be problematic, consider changing it to this. And it will actually recommend a specific hex code for a color you should use instead. So a different shade of blue that would then lead to it passing. So it's a really useful tool. Again, it's not going to solve. Yep.
You have a question about how to install this.
Sure. So if you go to the code sniffer, let's see if I can find it here. HTML code sniffer. There it is. You see this, get the accessibility auditor bookmarklet. You can actually drag this up to your bookmark bar, and it will add the bookmark to your page, and you can then do it on any page that you want. If you're a web developer and you're testing code, you can actually also just come to this page and paste it all in. But with the bookmarklet, anybody can use it. You don't have to have the back-end code. You can just click Run, and it will give you a basic report with all of those items. And it is fun. I think, like I said, I tested every website I could think of and then clicked through to see the errors. So it gives you a lot of background information and really can help explain why something might be problematic, whether it's a true error or whether it's just something that might be an issue that comes up as yellow, and really explains the why behind it and how you can address it. And obviously this doesn't address making documents accessible, but it is useful for making sure that things on your website are meeting the right accessibility standards and understanding why. Is there another question? Oh, okay, it's just a comment from Rebecca. Superstar Rebecca. So going back to the slides here, now that I've shown you my new favorite tool. So Rebecca's obviously talked about what's happening in Utah. Does anybody else have anything that they want to share or add about what might be happening in your states? Have there been previous efforts to address accessibility? What's worked, what hasn't worked? Successes are good, but challenges are good too, because we can kind of brainstorm together or share resources or thoughts that might help sort of move the process along. And certainly if there are additional resources, some of the things that like Rebecca was describing with the example document, one of the pieces that we're working on now should be ready, and it's with our publications department and working on making sure it's accessible, but should be ready in the next couple weeks, I think, and published on the CTD website, is an accessibility, kind of 1 to 2 page quick guide. What are the big things you need to think about when you're creating documents to make them accessible? And we have a text version that goes into more detail and provides a lot of resources for professional development, but we're also working on a graphic version that sort of shows, this is if you're talking about a website, what do you need to pay attention to? What elements do you need to make sure are covered? If you're talking about a PowerPoint or a Word document, what are the big pieces that you need to think about with regard to headers, with regard to the way you organize text, creating accessible PowerPoints, and linking you to those resources. So we'll have some of those examples and resources ready shortly that we can share with all of you. But are there other things that you feel like would be useful for your states or districts, or ways that we can help support that work for you, or at least point you in the right direction? I see Rebecca here has said some challenges that they've had is that they don't have an in-house publishing department, and that she's working sort of as an education specialist to figure it out. And another challenge is that training itself doesn't work very well, and that hands-on workshops seems to work the best. Agreed, definitely. One school that one district that we've talked to addressed this by using some really good tutorial videos through, are you all familiar with lynda.com? It's technology training videos. They, in addition to hands-on workshops, made subscription to these videos available to their teachers to really train them on the ins and outs of here's how you create an accessible Word document, and take them through activities. And that seemed to be fairly successful, the combination of hands-on workshops and then the availability of high-quality training videos that teachers could refer back to. Have other people tried to address this challenge, and if so, how? Or if you need resources, Devin and I are happy to help point you towards them. We've spent a lot of time reviewing tutorials and training videos and deciding which ones are good and which ones are more trouble than they're worth.
Yeah, and Elise, I just got word actually in response to Rebecca asked a question about who they can turn to figure out how to do some of this work and who could provide more training or information to troubleshoot things like this, for example, like making a PDF federally compliant. And I actually reached out to our internal publications department to see who they would suggest, and I literally 2 minutes ago got an email about some resources. So this is, hot off the presses, but just 2 companies that our internal team recommends that can work with states specifically to provide trainings are one on the East Coast. It's called Matrix 508, and another one called Net-Centric Communications. So we'll continue to look into other companies that could provide trainings if that's something that your state is interested in. But they are out there and available to support you.
Yeah, and another really great resource, I'm going to put this into the chat. The name of the company is called Free Play Media. They do, they do accessibility for videos and things like that and live captioning of events, but they also provide a huge library of free webinars every couple weeks on topics in accessibility, how to caption videos, how to do this work yourself if you don't want to pay somebody to do it, or you're in the situation to pay somebody to do it. So they have a lot of really great, and I'll put in the link too. It looked like somebody was just raising their hand. Is there a question?
I think it was an accident.
Well, now you've got to talk.
Yeah.
So I'll pull up that link momentarily, but I've used 3Play Media videos and webinars to help troubleshoot or answer some questions for me when I'm doing things like captioning videos and making sure that I'm captioning things correctly. It's especially when you're captioning events where people mumble or might stutter or do what I'm doing right now and say a lot. Knowing what the right conventions were. There's a lot of really great training materials on their website. So as part of taking stock is figuring out those types of questions. Like Rebecca said, they don't have a publications department. She's trying to figure out some of these things herself. It can be difficult to find the expertise. And so taking stock and doing some of the work that they've been doing in Utah and surveys, actually getting a sense for who knows some of these things or who has capacity already that can provide some level of support and training, but also looking at what external resources, whether it's doing what this district in Massachusetts did, which is purchasing licenses for online training in accessibility through Linda, or going through one of these organizations that Devin mentioned that can provide specific training and hands-on workshops in these topics. It depends on kind of what your state or LEA needs are. But identifying those resources and identifying the staff that can support that work. So we'll click through all these since Devin already did them. We're jumping around a little bit. So the piece that we wanted to sort of talk about in this plan is, once you've sort of taken the pulse and seen where things are, what some of the issues are, figured out who you've got built your team, what sort of level of internal expertise you have access to, what sort of external expertise you can bring in if you need to. Is really sitting down with your team and saying, okay, where are we? What are our big challenges? And how are we going to use this information to create our plan going forward? And if you don't currently have a shared vision of accessibility or talking about digital accessibility, if it's not on people's radar, or if it's on people's radar but in the sense that, well, this is a legal obligation, but it's not something that they, has yet become a part of the sort of fabric of the work that we do every day, developing a shared vision and really communicating that vision out to not just staff, but also to students, also to parents and other stakeholders in the community, that this is something that we're working very hard on, and we're very proud, of this, that we're working together to address these issues. Because it both, lets people know that this is a priority and that this is something that you're working on, but it also lets stakeholders know that if they do have a question or they do have a concern or they have something that they need help with, that you as a state or as an LEA, a school or a district, is going to be responsive and work to try to solve this problem. And it also, you'll probably get a lot of unsolicited feedback, which is good, because you'll get that buy-in, but you'll also get people who are comfortable saying, this is an issue, or I use this particular assistive technology and it didn't work for me, and people that are potentially willing to serve as testers for your materials. Because as Devin said, as much as I love that HTML code sniffer and these color contrast checkers, they can all do a lot of the work for us, but we need to have actual people involved, actual stakeholders involved that can help you and pick up things that a computer will miss. Computers aren't perfect yet. Is there a question, Devin?
No.
Oh, yeah, it was just you adding a link. Yeah, this is completely unrelated to accessibility, although it's not in some ways. But I don't know if you all read the story of Alexa ordering doll houses for a 6-year-old who asked Alexa to play dolls with her and get her a dollhouse. And so, technology often can figure out what we want. Certainly being able to use voice commands is a massive improvement, and sort of smart homes for people with physical disabilities or people with visual impairments. But there can also be some unintended consequences. Technology doesn't always know exactly what we want. It doesn't always pick up, issues, user accessibility issues that somebody might be having with a website or with our content, and it might accidentally order you a dollhouse when you don't want one. So adding people, involving your stakeholders, and having this really clear shared vision are all really important to get buy-in from additional partners, particularly disability organizations, local universities, and colleges can also be helpful in this work, whether it's grad students or just because they've gone through this process and they can share some of what they've learned. So is there, apart from Utah.
Well, we do have another question, Elise, about how to make PDFs web accessible, and if we have any resources around that. PDFs, I think, are one of the harder things to make accessible. But like I said, I just got an email today from, like 5 minutes ago, from our internal publications department with resources and links to some websites that might be able to guide you through it. So I can go ahead and put those in the chat as well. I haven't vetted any of these, and Elise and I haven't had a chance to look at them, but we're happy to provide them to you.
Yeah, and a good starting point, if you're making a PDF from a Word document, for example, and this isn't 100% foolproof, but a good starting point is to make sure that the Word document is structured in an accessible way. So, making sure if you're, instead of increasing the font size to make a header look bigger, using heading 1, heading 2 from, sorry, these pop up every time, from the actual styles menu, and using bulleted lists and using the styles for bolding and everything else, because that creates the sort of behind the scenes code that when you transfer it over to a PDF will be recognized as tags. That this is heading 1, this is heading 2, this is a bulleted list, this is a numbered list, this is an ordered list, unordered list. And putting in, if there's images, putting in the alt text from the beginning. And again, that's not going to necessarily be perfect, but it'll address a lot of the accessibility issues if you start out with a document that's built in an accessible way. Because it's a lot, I have not done this as much as Devin, but it sounds like it's sometimes a lot more challenging to go in and try to fix it in the PDF than to start out with something that is already tagged appropriately using the Microsoft, built-in styles. And the same with PowerPoints. Actually, I can show you. This one will come up clean because I just ran it, but if I go to, and you can do this with all the Microsoft products, I can check for issues, and I can check accessibility. And I've already gone through this, but one of the things it will tell me is to check the reading order. And quite often with slides, even though I've set it up and I've used headers and a text box and everything else, the reading order will be out of order. And I don't know why PowerPoint insists on doing it that way. But I have to go through and specifically make sure that heading 1 comes first, the text box comes next. The images on the slide come in the right order. So for each of those, you can go through and check.
Well, and some of this sometimes is getting to know the software too. So reading order in PowerPoint, sometimes if this is the first time you're looking at it, it doesn't make sense because you expect it to go from top to bottom. And in PowerPoint, when you're ordering things, they want you to go from bottom to top. I don't know if you could show that, Elise, real quick.
Sure. So like, the way to check it is you come to your home screen and you go to Arrange in the selection pane, and it will show me what order things are in on the slide. And I can't, the box here, my little toolbar is in my way, but I can go through and I can adjust using the arrow keys or just clicking and dragging to put things in the order that I want them to. And this is then the order that the slide will be read in by a screen reader. And you can do similar things in Microsoft Word. If you look at the table of contents that's created or how it pulls out to create an outline, you'll see, oh, this is showing up as a header, this is coming next, and is this in the order and the way that I would want it to be read. And so by addressing those issues in your original source material before you necessarily turn something into a PDF, you can address a lot of the accessibility issues and ensure that your PDF is more accessible. And then Devin just put a bunch of resources into the text box for additional tips and tricks for developing 508 compliant or accessible documents.
Yeah, PDF, if you're in Adobe, it has weird nesting, and you'll put a header one place, and then when you try to go back and add something else, it moves the order. So it does take some playing around with. I will say that our internal publications department likes PDFs more than they like PowerPoints. Like, to them, now that they know how to do it, it's more intuitive. Like, yes, you have to play around with it. So I say that to give you hope that even though it can seem overwhelming, I think once you get the hang of it, you really got it. And then, Elise, real quick, Rebecca also wanted to know what the menu you went to for reading order in PowerPoint. Can you just show that one more time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let me get out of my slides here again. Okay. So in order, she wants to see where you find the reading order?
Yeah, and yep, the reading order.
So if you go to Arrange and Selection pane, so here on the home menu, over here there's, and this is where you can group objects and everything, and you have this option down here for Selection pane. again. And then you can see the order that things are on the slides. And each one will sort of highlight. So if you aren't, these slides are fairly simple. There's not a lot of, let's find one that's not simple. This one is not simple. Because there's so many little icons and making things pretty. So each of these icons I had to go in and add alt text for. And then I had to also go through and make sure that the order was correct. And it was not at all, so I had to restructure everything so that it would actually go in order. But you can see when I click on each of these, picture 3, it tells me, it highlights where it is on the slide. And so when you run the accessibility checker and it brings up potential issues for you, and you click on those issues, it'll show you exactly where on the slide. It'll tell you this, it'll highlight this image, for example, our AIR logo, and say this does not have alt text. And so then you can go through and add all of those things fairly easily. And if you do want to add alt text, you can go to, you select the image and you format the picture. You've got all these options for making it pretty. And you can see that there's an option here for alt text. And because this is just a logo, people don't really need a lot of information about it. And knowing that it's a logo allows them to just skip over it and not hear a description read. Looks like is there another question? Tell you what is not accessible is this question box. Trying to see if there's a new question while I'm also presenting. I'll leave that to you, Devin, while
no, we're good.
So let's go back to, oh, actually, I just looked at the clock. Goodness gracious, it's 4:07. So if there's any other questions, or if you want to email Devin or I directly, we'll also send out these slides right after the webinar to everybody because they have links to, you can see here, to the example vision statements, links to the tools that we mentioned, and we'll include also some links to tutorials for doing these kinds of things. But if you, in your work with your states, if you come across more issues or specific questions that you have or specific resources that would help support this work, please let us know. We may, as with some of these things, we may already have them in development and be ready to share them in another week or two, or it may be something that we add to our list and say, oh, that's a really great resource, and we'll develop that because it would be useful for a lot of people. And if we don't have it, we will know where to find it, or we'll do the work to help you find it. So thank you all so much for sharing and for asking questions. And like I said, please feel free to email Devin or I directly, and we're happy to help support your work in any way that we can.
Thanks, everyone.
And oh, Marcelina will yell at me if I don't say this. There is a survey. As a federally funded project, we always collect feedback on any of the work that we do, so we would appreciate it, and it would help us, improve our work if you could fill out the survey. Marcelina will also send out the link to everybody in email, but it's in the chat right now. And like I said, when Marcelina sends out the link to the survey, we will also send out the slides so you guys have access to all of the links and tools that we talked about and the resources that we shared today. So thank you so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And for sure, let us know if there's any resources or any additional resources that would be helpful to you, and Devin and I will get them out to you quickly.